In this video, I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes going through how to set up an FTP server to work with the nanodac recorder controller to allow the nanodac to archive its data remotely. For this particular example, I am working on a Windows 10 VM. This same process should apply regardless of the operating system or the physical piece of hardware. I'm also using FileZilla, which is a free open source and very robust piece of software that I've used for a number of years. This should apply to for the most part, the setup that I'm doing here. Foundation of it should apply to any FTP server software, but again, for this example, I'm using the FileZilla software. So if you go to the website, filezilla-project.org, you'll be presented with two different versions. The client is the actual software to talk to an FTP server. We want to download the FileZilla server. Now, I've already done this to save a little bit of time here, so we can go over to downloads and just run the software. If you haven't changed any of your user access controls, you will get these pop-ups on Windows 10. Of course, it changes for different operating systems. Go ahead and hit yes. It's going to come up with license agreement, read through it, hit agree. You can leave the standard configuration here, hit next. If you want to change a different location, by all means, please do. Now, I would highly suggest leaving this as is. What this is saying is that when Windows starts, that the FileZilla server will also run. If you don't do this, you can absolutely choose to start it manually, but it does make it more inconvenient to do. So leave it as default, hit next, hit install, and give it about another 10 seconds for it to finish up the operation here. Once it's done, go ahead and hit close, and it will pop up with the interface. The interface here is key. This is literally 50% of the setup, and there's not a lot to it. The host is going to be local because we've just installed it to our machine, but if we were installing this on another VM, another server, a physically different location, we would be putting in the IP address. Let's go ahead and hit OK. The interface is designed for setting up the FTP server, nothing more, nothing less. You can leave this open to watch the connection of remote devices, which we'll use here. But the main thing you guys should be focusing on is this little icon with the user in front of a computer. When you click on it, this is the user's interface. First thing we need to do is add a user. Um, there's a lot of different ways we can attack this. I typically keep one specific user, but if you have different directories, different functionalities, it may be a good idea to have multiple users. So for example, we can create a user called nanodac. It's very generic for archiving data. But because the nanodac also has the ability to connect to an FTP server, to pull recipes for the setpoint programmer, you may want to create another one called nanodac recipe or whatever you want to call it. And the reason why you do that is you can associate different home directories, which we'll get into here in a second, for those particular logins. Either way, it doesn't matter. It's just the methodology that I use. So I'm going to go ahead and create an account called nanodac. Go ahead and OK. You can assign a password for this example. I'm not going to do it to keep it simplistic. And that's all you have to do as far as users. The next thing here is the shared folders. So by default, there are no folders shared, so we have to add one. I've already created a folder called FTP, as you can see here. So I'm going to select that file, and when you do so, notice that there is an H right in front of it. That indicates it's the home directory. This terminology is relatively similar across different server platforms, but for the most part, what this is saying is that when the nanodac logs in, this is the directory that it's placed into, or in other words, it's the root. Normally in a Windows environment, this would be your C drive, but when you log into the nanodac, you cannot go to any other folder outside of FTP. You can get access into FTP, but nothing outside. That's what the H indicates, and that's what I would highly suggest. And there's a reason for that here in a second. Also, you will also need to make sure you have the correct attributes. So if we look underneath here, we've got read, which is pretty straightforward. We do need to write. We need to be able to log in and save the UHH files. Deleting is really not a big deal because there's really no reason why the nanodac would ever delete it. In fact, I don't think it has the capability to delete files. So you can leave it checked or unchecked, but you do have to have append. And the reason for this is the UHH files are continuously written to while the nanodac is running. In the event that there's a power cycle, you start a new batch, you go into configuration, a couple of other different reasons, a UHH file will continually be written to until it meets a certain size expectation. Then it will generate a new UHH file. So if you're logging into the FTP server every minute, which is complete overkill, but let's just say you are, chances are you're not going to meet one of those criteria and you're going to continue to write to the same UHH file. If you don't give it the append characteristics, it's going to try to write to that same file, and it won't be able to, and you'll get an error. So make sure you have the ability to append the file for the nanodac account. As far as directories go, you can leave these unchecked. I'm going to go ahead and check them. Again, there's no reason why I should ever delete a directory, but if you have folders within the home directory, you may want to hit create in the event that you create a new folder on the nanodac. It should be able to create them. I always create my folders ahead of time, but again, that's based on preference. That's it. That's literally all you have to do for the FTP side of things. Again, this could change based on what server interface you're using, but for FileZilla, that is it. Now, if I go back over to my iTools interface, what I've just done here, I've loaded more or less a blank nanodac configuration over to my nanodac, with the exception of 4 channels that are set up for test signals just to generate random data. Um, that being said, those 4 signals are being recorded at 1-second intervals, and this should give you a good idea of how you need to set up the nanodac to talk to an FTP server. So first thing I need to do, again, is select the nanodac that I want to connect to, hit access, and log in with the default password. Now, where we want to focus on is on the left-hand side. If we're looking at Parameter Explorer, right, going down, you click on the network interface, and some of the confusion is right here at FTP server. FTP server, this is used if you're using our piece of software called Review, and you're logging into the nanodac to view its internal contents. So this is the username and password that Review has to use to get access to it. You do not need to mess with this information in order to have the nanodac connect to a FTP server. That's part of the confusion that I've seen over the years. Um, I get why there is confusion there, but keep in mind this is not something that you need to mess with in terms of the communication to the FTP server. Where you actually need to look into is underneath the archive folder. Now, underneath archive, you've got some various information. This is where you can set up the nanodac to archive at specific intervals and what kind of data it needs to archive, so on and so forth. But for this particular example, what we want to focus on is down here. So first thing we need to look at is remote path. If we leave this as /archive, what this means is that when it logs into the home directory, which is the C:/FTP, it will put its data within the archive folder. So you may do this if you have 3 different nanodacs, 3 different furnaces, for example. They may be named something unique, and I would highly recommend you placing in individual folders rather than just one main folder. It just keeps things more organized. But for this example, we're not going to actually utilize this. We're just going to put the root. So we can just put a slash here, hit enter, and be done with it. That just means when I log in, use the root, nothing more, nothing less. We also need to put in the IP address. The IP address of the server is 192.168.1.208, I believe. I'll go back. Yeah, .208. Then you need to put in the user account, nanodac, and if I had a password, I would enter it in right here. I know I went through that quickly, but again, that's all that needs to be done on the nanodac. So we've gone through, we've set up the FTP server, we've gone through and we've set up the nanodac all in a matter of about 5 minutes. Once we're done, we can go ahead and get back out of this so that the nanodac is recording. And let's go back to our VM here. Minimize this. Now the interface, guys, is again, not only do you set up the FTP server here, this also will indicate any connections from remote sources. Now, typically in a Windows 7 install, when FileZilla is installed, it normally adds a rule to the firewall. By default, port 2120 is usually blocked just because that's a very easy port to get access to, and typically you don't want to have that locked down. In Windows 7, it normally adds that firewall to allow traffic. In Windows 10, I don't believe it does. And we can quickly test this. First thing here. So we can go into the firewall. And this is kind of mimicked similarly in the Windows 7 environment, but it's a little bit different. Now, normally, what you could do is you can go in advanced settings. You can take a look at inbound and outbound rules. And inbound, you should have something here for FileZilla. And it looks like there actually is some rules. So interestingly enough, it does look like they add them, but it's not enabled. And chances are, if you don't enable these, then that means no traffic's going to get through. So even though we can ping it, we can talk to it, um, it's not going to be able to communicate. So make sure you go into the firewall and enable these rules. Assuming you're installing this software on a Windows environment, there are a lot of other ways you may need to get your IT personnel involved. So we'll go ahead and leave these enabled. We'll go ahead and exit that. I'll just downsize that for now. So now at the nanodac, I know you can't see this, but I'm going to go ahead and log in as supervisor. I'm just going to do a demand archive. Type in my default password of 100. Accept. I'm going to go down to demand archiving. When you go to demand archiving, you can choose what you want to archive to where, whether it's the USB stick or your FTP server. I'm going to go ahead and click FTP server and archive the last hour. Now, when I hit scroll, you should see some text come up on the screen in front of you indicating that I am connected to it, transferring data. So I'm going to go ahead and hit scroll right now. It appears that it is not connecting. So I would imagine that this is because of something within the firewall. Even though we did enable it, it still looks like it's giving us a little bit of a problem. Perhaps I overlooked something in the firewall. Let's take a look at it. Let's go back to advanced settings here. Inbound rules. FileZilla should be enabled. But do we want to have it on domain? I think this actually wants to be set to private. Let's go on properties here. Well, we're definitely not on a domain for sure. That's probably why we're giving a problem here. I think through the VM we're probably on a private network. Let's go ahead and apply there. And let's do the same here. This might be part of the problem. Because it's only applying to the fact that if this was actually on domain, then would it actually utilize it? So back on the nanodac, it did say that it failed. Let's go back and let's do last hour again. That was it. That was the problem. So again, bringing somebody within IT is always key here. Again, it's not like this on Windows 7. It's actually a little bit more simplistic, but Windows 10 is a little bit more locked down. So something to keep in mind, guys. FTP firewall usually comes into play here. I probably as easily could have just gone back to the firewall and just hit allow app. FileZilla is probably not here. It is added here actually. It must have just been added because I enabled it. But we could always add an app here and specify FileZilla. So the files did transfer. You saw them here. Just kind of gives you an idea of what's going on. Let's go ahead and go to our FTP. And as you guys will see here, here are the files that were just transferred. Time is 8:53, which was just a minute ago. And I also created this folder called nanodac just to kind of simulate if we had multiple folders. Now, there's nothing in it, but what we can do is go back into iTools. Let's go into access mode. And this time, let's do, I called it nanodac, didn't I? Yeah, so the folder was called nanodac. So what I've just done, now that I'm going back and forth between the screens here, I've gone in here and I've said, now when I log in, I want you to put the files into the nanodac folder. So again, this could be the name of the nanodac, whatever you specifically named it. This could be the particular piece of equipment that the nanodac is on, whatever way you guys want to uniquely identify it. So that's it. Again, me logging in, logging out does not affect the fact that if I can or cannot archive, you can stay logged in. It's just a good habit to log out. We'll go back to our FTP server. I'll leave both windows open here. You should see some text scroll here. You should see some files pop into the nanodac. I'm going to go ahead and hit archive, and we're going to do the last hour again. Hit scroll. And again, as you can see, it logs in transfer files into the folder. As simple as that. So again, the video is now coming up on 15 minutes. I want to make sure that this made sense in terms of how to set up the FTP interface on the nanodac, as well as setting up something like FileZilla. It definitely works on the nanodac. It always has worked, but there are some particular areas where they can easily be overlooked, whether it's the configuration of the user, the attributes, the firewall settings, or perhaps one of the settings within the nanodac. So hopefully that resolved any issues you may have. Thanks for watching.